So we've actually got two people from Royal Flying Doctor Service here today. Dr. Greenburg has been living here in Dubbo for 15 years. Prior to that, he was a psychiatric nurse. He's done rural GP in Burke, Milton, Ulladulla. He's practiced anaesthetics, obstetrics, surgery. He says that he had a rush of blood to the head and he changed careers. He trained as an emergency physician at Royal North Shore and Liverpool, and he's currently the Chief Medical Officer for the Royal Flying Doctor Service in New South Wales. He's the Director of Critical Care for Dubbo Hospital. He's also the Associate Professor at Sydney University and the School of Rural Health here in Dubbo, the State Retrieval Consultant with New South Wales Ambulance, and he provides remote advice to remote health facilities at Western New South Wales LHD via telehealth. And I said, Dr. Greenburg, do you have any hobbies? He said, no, I've got lots of children. I thought, alrighty. Dr. Greenburg's also brought his senior flight nurse with him, Pete. Can we give them a warm welcome, please?
Thank you. Point and shoot, yeah. It's a bit hard to follow that. It was pretty emotional. I just wanted to talk about a job I did a few years ago and had some very interesting factors to it. I was a state retrieval consultant this particular day and they put a call through to me. He said, Randall, can you take this call for us? There was a fellow called Aaron Casey who was the Health Relationship Manager for Western Sydney for New South Wales Ambulance. And he said, look, we got this 19-year-old autistic male that needs to be relocated from one house to another in Western Sydney. And he's 6 foot tall and he's 130 kilos, he's non-verbal, has behavioural issues. So I sort of thought, gee, it's not something we usually do in the retrieval service. So I called my boss and he got on the line. We had a chat about it. And we said, can you just send us a bit more information? So here is the story. So he lives with his mother and his brother in a house in Padstow, and it had been condemned. It was just falling down. So, but they'd built a purpose-built house sort of nearly a year before for him to move into, but they just couldn't move him. So it's 2.2 kilometres away. Google Maps says it takes 4 minutes to get there. They just couldn't move him into this new house. So he hadn't left the street since 2011, so that's sort of 6 years. They actually, I don't quite know how all these agencies work, but they couldn't get him out, but someone put an eviction notice, so they were going to be forcibly evicted, but then given that no one could move him, I don't know how they were going to do that. So all these services were involved, and I don't know what half of this means. I only found out what ADHC meant when I Googled it. Ageing, Disability and Home Care, which is part of FACS, which is the Department of Family and Community Services. So there's speech pathologists, occupational therapists, psychologists, senior CSO, specialist housing. I don't even know what that means. But there was lots of people involved, lots of agencies involved. So then there was lots of attempts to move William. So in July 2016, someone contacted the social worker at Bankstown. They said, well, what do we do? And they said, maybe you should contact the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Service, or maybe New South Wales Ambulance, or maybe the police. And then they called NDIS and they sort of could put packages, but they can't really do this sort of moving. The ambulance said they'd assist, but they needed the hospital involvement, and that sort of went round and round in circles, and that just didn't happen. They got community mental health, but he didn't have an acute mental illness, so no, they weren't going to help. Then they referred to the quality reform team. I don't know what that means. They contacted Patient Transport New South Wales, like the transport vans, and they said, no, we can't help. Anyway, and then in October, they got a private transport company that does sort of air and road transports. Doctor and 2 nurses, they gave, I think, 1 dose of diazepam orally, 10 milligrams, and that didn't work. There's this mob called SAL Consulting, which specifically look at disability, people with disabilities. They consulted a doctor there. They couldn't help, but they suggested they contact a private transport organisation, in fact the one that had just previously failed. They tried 2 psychiatrists, but they don't do home visits. 2 other private transport organisations contacted, unable to assist. Then they hired an accessible vehicle for 2 weeks, and they tried to entice him out of the house with sort of treats, putting him in there. That didn't work. And then they still had the vehicle, and they gave him 10 milligrams of diazepam, tried to entice him out, but that didn't work. Then they got a private paramedical organisation under the direction of a developmental psychiatrist and a paediatrician, and they gave 30 milligrams of diazepam orally over 3 hours, and that didn't work. But then they presented the case to the senior integrated case panel, which I don't really know what that means, but it seemed fairly senior, and they made a formal request to New South Wales Health. Now that was in December 2016, and then that sort of went round and round, and no one knew what to do. It just went round and round. And then somehow Aaron Casey got it, and that's when he made the phone call to us. New South Wales Ambulance said the retrieval service won't do it. It's not our job. Denied it, citing risk to patient, staff, as well as legal issues. So I sort of looked at it and I thought, we could do this as a service. We regularly sedate people. We regularly manage airways of sedated people. So I spoke to my colleague Peter Brent, who some of you all know. He's German. And I said, Pete, do you reckon we could do this? And he said, of course we could. Of course we could. So then I thought I'd better speak to the chief executive, because this was not without risk. This is purely elective, large man, predicted difficult airway. This could go bad. So I did discuss it with our chief executive. I said, look, we're a charity. This is the sort of thing. You could feel in the documentation, and particularly Aaron Casey's voice, you could feel the frustration. No one wanted to do this. So I spoke to the chief executive and he said, we can do this. So then we went back and I said, look, we'll do this. But then I said, you're going to have to make sure the legal issues are okay. So they had to apply for guardianship under an accommodation function. A lot of us are familiar with guardianship under medical issues. We have to get guardianship to do certain procedures on people that can't consent. So all these other people were doing stuff in the background. So they got approved for coercive accommodation, medical, dental, and restrictive practice authorisation, so physical and chemical restraint. So we had the legal issues sorted. Preparation, numerous teleconferences, including discussions with mother. I thought, we'll just, Pete and I and the other Dr. Pete, we'll just go down there with our bags and get into Rex or Qantas and fly down. And then Pete and the other Pete the doctor, said, Randall, we're going to have to take all of our retrieval gear, because if this goes bad, we're going to have to be able to intubate him and do everything we would normally do for an intensive care patient. So that meant we need a plane. So I then had to go to the aviation people and say, can we have a plane for a day? And we're actually able to organise that. So the team was myself as an emergency physician, Peter Brent, who was a specialist anaesthetist, Pete Smith, senior flight nurse, and we took an ED registrar with us as well. We kept thinking this could really go pear-shaped, so I rang the director of Bankstown ED, told him what we're doing, said, look, hopefully you won't see us, but just letting you know, if you get an intubated autistic big man come through your door on this particular day, this is what's happened. He was fine. So the date was planned. It was actually another flight nurse, it was Brendan, and he got a cold, so then we had to postpone. So can you imagine the logistics of all this? Anyway, finally the day came. So we had a new date, 2nd of May 2017. We flew to Dubbo in an RFDS plane, asked all our gear, picked up from the airport with New South Wales Ambulance, taken to the Bankstown Superstation.
Bankstown Superstation.
Yep. Briefing. So they had 3 ambulance crews just dedicated to this job, taken off the road. And also, all of us were in civvies because we've been told that he didn't like uniforms. William didn't like uniforms, so we're all in civvies. We had this briefing. I'll get Pete to talk more about that, but one of the things that I remember, and it's interesting talking about the human factors issues, about cognitive bias. Peter Brent, the doctor, said, there's one thing we've all got to remember. This has been a logistically incredibly hard. We've come down from Dubbo. We've got 3 ambulance crews, 6 paramedics dedicated to this. We must be prepared to abort. If something goes wrong, if we get there and we find out he's got a rattly cough or for whatever reason, we must be in the mind frame that if things are going to go wrong, we must be prepared to abort. And that hadn't crossed my mind, but when he said, I thought, what a great thing to say that he actually thought of that. Do you want to talk a bit more about the brief, what we planned?
Sure. So we got picked up from Mascot and we all went to the Bankstown Superstation and sat down with all the crews. We've talked about a lot of debriefing things post cases. This was good. This was a pre-briefing, pre-case, where we could all sit down and exchange our information about what we knew about the case, what we knew about the site and the environment and the situation around him, and we could adequately brief all the crews with what our plan was going to be, and the fact that it was outside of general lines of what we would, doing a community sedation and not going to a hospital facility. So it was good to sit down and everyone could discuss their worries and their concerns, and also come up with a plan that we could all be on board with before we went, and that included the plan to abort. Like we said, there was lots of logistics involved, and people don't like to pull the pin when all that time and effort has gone in, but we need to know that if it's not safe, then we had to know where the line was and pull and stop.
So then we all assembled at the house. This is ambulances parked we're just a bit down the road, we're all in civvies. And so we had the RFDS team, the 3 crews, so 6 paramedics, and there was 4 of us, so there was 10 people. I think Aaron was there, so there was 11. So we all got ready there, and we had this plan where we decided Peter Brent, who was an anaesthetist, would go there and do the main sedation and airway. So they went up to the front door, and William, who hadn't been out of the house, I think, for
4 years?
4 years, decided this was the day he was going to run out of the house naked. So we're out the front in this suburban street, and he's just running around, and we're going.
I think also too that when we turned up, the patient had previous experiences with emergency services, both police and ambulance, where he hadn't had a very good outcome. He was where he had previously been sedated and shackled and taken to ED, so he had a high suspicion and a great fear of people in ambulance. Hence why we went down in civvies and just plain clothes. And on approach to the house, we tried to have a low presence of uniform ambulance and ambulances in general. And the plan was for Peter Brent, the medical officer, to go in and assess him along with Adam, who had contact with the patient prior. But over the last 3 days, they had been trying to kind of prep him and give him cues. This patient was profoundly autistic, and did have barriers to communication and comprehension about, coupled with his agoraphobia. So the plan was initially to go in and chat to him, and then just calmly give him some sedation and bring him out.
Sure. Like, what could go wrong?
He got wind of that straight away and went bowling out the door. To which his uncle then said, "Well, at least you fixed his agoraphobia."
So he had a favourite uncle that was there helping. He was very helpful and useful, and the mother was all on board with this. We'd had multiple conversations with her.
We then had an unexpected event of what do we do? We now had a very large, extremely agitated and extremely naked man in a front yard with a plan. So we then withdrew. But
we did talk about, should we do a takedown? Because we had 10 people. We theoretically, that was. But we did talk about it. So and we said, no, let's maybe not. So
we did. We withdrew and then regrouped and then came up with a plan. And we did talk about doing a takedown. And we thought, but we then realised that the risk was probably great to the patient in hurting and harming the patient, and the risk to the crews as well. Also, just generally, the view from the public of then sedating a very large naked person in their front yard, which is a completely elective procedure and not for
Cars
any other reason.
Past, people walking past.
Would be inappropriate. So we then aborted, we then withdrew, and luckily he then withdrew back into the house, and then Pete was able then to go in.
So we had then Peter Brent was there, the anaesthetist, with a couple of paramedics and the mother and the uncle, and they just basically, Peter with his syringe of ketamine, 500 milligrams of ketamine, that's 2.5 ampules, just sort of ran in and sort of through the trousers, sort of jabbed him with the ketamine. I don't know if you've ever used ketamine for sedation with a big IM dose. It works really quickly. So I did one the other day and timed it. It's 4 minutes, completely out. So he's then completely out to it.
Luckily, he withdrew into his bedroom and then decided to go to his bed after the ketamine, which made it a lot more easier in some aspects. But then we had the problem. Then we had to then extract him from the house, where in the driveway we'd set up our stretcher and ventilator and litter, so we could manage him once he came out. Took about, because he's 130 kilos, it took about 6 paramedics to come out. Once we got him onto the stretcher, we were then able to put...
I've got to say, the house was awful. It was just... it was really like they were living in squalor, because he wasn't using the bathroom and it just stank, didn't it? Just stank of urine.
And because they'd condemned it, there was no further services on that home for a period of time, which was an old, like, dilapidated home anyway. So that also had a lot of issues. That we had issues on the scene with light, access, and then also just working in a fairly unclean environment. Once we did extract him, we could then get him into our cot, and then put monitoring on,
so then we got access. Our registrar then got 2 IVs in, and then actually, to be quite honest, once we had him sedated, I felt like that was the hardest bit done. I thought, right, we've now got control of the situation. So then we started a ketamine infusion, and we also had some dexamethasone and some lignocaine as well. To present laryngospasm and nausea, and then Pete, do you want to describe the 4-minute journey? Was it anything to talk about?
We had a very long...
for a cup of tea on the way through?
That's right. We had a very long and complex travel transfer for 4 minutes to a house. It was long, but we got there. I think that was the kind of gravity of this, that we've now electively sedated someone with a lot of risk factors. To move him 4 minutes into a new home was huge.
So we're now reaching the hard bit. So, and this was what everyone was talking about beforehand, and this is why no one wanted to do it, because we sedate people regularly. All the retrieval services sedate people. Most of you in this room have sedated people, but then you take them to a hospital where they then wake up and from their anaesthetic or from their sedation. We're now going to get him to wake up in a home. And there's some other issues that we'll talk about. Now that's everyone crowding to get him into the house. Do you want to talk a bit about access?
I think this was a thing that we never really contemplated, but most of our job is getting people out of buildings, not into buildings, and especially bariatric patients out of buildings.
So we talked about Emma going to getting your bloke out of that office. We're now trying to get someone into a place.
And then looking at the risk again of that, we're now taking someone who's sedated into a house where there's poor access, to put him into a room where there's even worse access, to then bring out sedation. It's completely reverse to what we would do if we would sedate someone and take them to an ED with lots of room and lots of airways and lots of people who can do things, where we're taking him in the direct opposite of that. So we had a lot of problems in getting him through, like getting a striker through a door, getting him into his bedroom and then onto his bed.
Somehow we did it.
We did. Those strikers are amazing where you can fit them, and we did manage to get him into his room where they already had a bed and some of his stuff set up. The other thing that was important for him was, when we'll talk about waking him up, you can talk about waking up.
So it's probably, as I said, the most risky part of the operation. He's not in a clinical environment. There's an added complication. I said, if he wakes up and sees you, then he's going to freak out. So you can't be around when he wakes up. We're going, okay, right, this is great. So once we located in the house, 2 of the other ambulance crews were released, so we still had 1 on scene plus us. We had a command post at the front yard with all our medical equipment. We had all our advanced air equipment. We had it all ready, just ready to go, just in case. So the ketamine was ceased and the propofol commenced. I don't know if you've ever seen someone come out from emergence delirium from a ketamine. They can go quite troppo, so that was something we really wanted to avoid. So that's Peter Brent and Pete. That's just swapping over the ketamine to the propofol in the house. So we had the problem of we're outside and Mum's inside. So Mum actually so he's on the monitors, he's asleep, and Mum was FaceTiming with us outside so that he didn't wake up with us. So
I think the important thing that was waking him up was that we were trying to minimise. Obviously, it's a huge change for him, and then having ketamine on board, and then propofol and emerging out of the sedation, he's going to be already disorientated. And also with his autism, he's already quite agitated and sort of confounded with being in a foreign environment, which was a new home he'd never been to. So to minimise that, we tried to fill the room with things that were familiar to him, like beds and blankets. He liked the radio and music, so we had that on. And then it was to minimise strangers in the room, which was us, because he didn't really know us, because he saw us for about a minute before the ketamine went in. So we tried to minimise where we were, but we still needed to have good surveillance on him while he was still sedated. So this was our solution, was to FaceTime the monitor and the patient so we could remotely monitor him, and then if there was a change in numbers or a change in his condition, we could then go in and do advanced.
So one of the other things we talked about was we thought we're going to stay around till we're happy that this guy's safe, because the disaster for us would be something goes wrong and then suddenly he's rushed to hospital with, RFDS has buggered off back to Dubbo, and we did not want that to happen. So how long do we stay around was the question. So we just had to make sure he was safely recovered. And Aaron Casey was terrific. He said, look, I'll visit them later on this evening to check on them. So we stayed for several hours. It was quite weird. We had all this gear in the front yard. People were sort of driving past.
People thought we were on a drug bust, I think, because they all thought we were detectives, because we were all standing around with ambulance and civvies,
that's right,
and collars. So they kept saying who you're arresting.
And all the cars were slowing as they were sort of going, rubbernecking, who are these guys? So anyway, we stayed for several hours and then basically started moving a bit. And the other problem was, as Pete said, he hadn't slept for 3 days. So now we've put him to sleep. He's asleep. So, but we're happy that he was moving, and he at some stage sat up, and we waited for a long time. And don't forget, the infusions only went for a very short time.
And they were short-acting agents, but we had that problem that we knew that he was likely going to be fatigued after he was sedated, because he had spent, I think they worked out he had about 4 hours sleep in about a 36-hour period. And so he was extremely awake and alert when we got there. But I think once we then sedated him, then that fatigue kind of took over, and then he wasn't going to wake up for anyone.
So the aftermath. Oh look, it was honestly, it was fantastic. Think about this. They had been trying for a year. No, all these attempts, and no one would do it, and they ring for no job. How good. Mum just come out. She just gave us these huge hugs and was sort of crying, going, "Oh, thank you. I just can't thank you enough for this." And there was all these, the social workers and the fax case workers. They'd been witnessing all this happen, and of course they can't do what we can do. They can't sedate people and move people, and so but they're trying to make it happen, and they just couldn't for a year. And then it happened. They were going, "You did it! You did it!" And it was actually really, really terrific. Dramatically changed the lives of the family. So the brother, who was sort of on the spectrum but fairly functional, he wasn't able to attend school when they were living in this other house, even though it was only down the road. But he's now, his grades improved dramatically. This is what we found out from the mother, and also from Aaron, who kept visiting them. William now goes outside and sits on the porch.
I think the other caveat to that as well, that William then, once he was in the new environment, then started to become continent, which was huge for his mother, which, I mean, I don't know if that sounds trivial when I say it on stage, but for her life, and then managing a home and managing William and just William's general dignity and care was huge.
And they're now not living in squalor. That place was really, when it was condemned, it was awful. So a team from Dubbo flew to Sydney, relocated someone 2.2 kilometres around the corner. So how did that happen? Well, we had the skills, and of course there's all those people in Sydney with all those skills, but we actually had the skills and we were the only ones that were willing to do the task. And perhaps that was partly due to our organisation. That's, I think we're a charity, but our prime function is to provide medical care to the outback, but to provide medical care to people. And I think that's why the Chief Executive said, if you think it's a good thing for us to do, then we should do it. So in conclusion, it was a great team effort. So we've talked about what we did, but all those people that I've got no idea what they do, all the people from the family and community services, the social workers, they organised all that guardianship stuff. That was a lot of work to get all that organised. There was a speech pathologist that actually did a storybook. We had to send our photos down to her, and she sort of had some way of communicating where somehow to explain to him that he was going to be moving and then he was going to wake up in a new place. I've got to mention Aaron Casey. He was really good at getting this whole thing together. And he used to go and visit, on his way home, he'd pop in and see how Mum was going and see how it was all going. He did that for many months afterwards. So I think he was terrific. And I've got to say, it was one of the most satisfying endeavours I've been involved in my career. So we're all involved in health here, and you might save a life, but in the back of your mind you think, well, I've saved a life, but probably if you'd been there you would have done the same thing, and I'm not special. But this was where I knew that no one else was going to do it, and we did it. So that to me made it very satisfying for me. Pete, you?
Absolutely. I think what this case sort of highlighted for me, and I think the rest of the team as well, was that all the different parts and all the different organisations that go in to do a transfer, and this case, I mean, we're used to doing big transfers that are hundreds of kilometres, from rural to metro centres, but just to move someone 2.5 kilometres, the integration and the cooperation, the collaboration with all the ambulance crews, the 3 different crews working out of the new Bankstown base, and the way we all worked together, it was a fairly seamless day. Yeah. It was a great example of how different agencies come together to achieve a common goal like that.
And that's all. Thank you very much.
Very good.